Hello everyone. Welcome to Module 6 of Being Your Own Boss, Courageous or Crazy. I'm Carl Dierschow. I'm with Small Fish Business Coaching, and we have again today a industry expert here, somebody who has actually been doing this thing. He's going to talk to us about early stage equity fundraising. So hang on, we're going to get into some great stuff today, very informative. Leslie, take it away.
Great, thank you, Carl. Again, I'm Leslie Lautzenhiser with FranChoice, and I'm just so glad you all are back for this one. This one is going to be a great one for everybody who is thinking about getting in business, and the big stumbling point tends to be how I'm going to fund this. With us on the call today, once again, joining us from last session, continuing the talk on funding, is Gordon Nuttall, CEO of Couragent, a Fort Collins-based company, who was the recipient of the first Quid Novi Innovation Award here in Fort Collins a few years ago, and I've had the pleasure of working with him since then. Gordon, I'd like to welcome you back with us today. Gordon.
Well, thank you, Leslie and Carl, for that introduction, and welcome to all of those who are listening in. I hope I'm able to give you a little bit of my feet on the streets perspective of what it's taken for my company, Couragent, to get where it's at over the last 2.5, maybe 3 years of raising funds. And this is going to be the second part of a two-step process, which is last session I talked about how important it is to determine the goals for your company and what is your exit strategy or liquidity event, because really that's going to drive most of the decisions that you're going to be making. And last week we talked about some of the different aspects of debt financing. Well, today I would like to talk more about equity and how this company, Couragent, went through different phases involving first the founding members, investing in bootstrapping, and then we used several rounds of private placements. We also utilized sweat equity by our consultants. I'm currently doing a direct public offering, and in that mode it's called crowdfunding. There's a variety of different types, and I'm going to talk about crowdfunding of equity. And again, a disclaimer here, like I just said last week, which is if your long-term goals for your company is to go public with an initial public offering, that's not my cup of tea. I'm not going to cover that today at all. My company's goal is to stay privately held, and I haven't done any adequate research about what it would take to actually go public with our offering.
So Gordon, before you start here, most of the people here are very familiar with debt funding because, you know, we all have debts in our personal lives and we owe people money, and so we're pretty familiar with how that works. But perhaps people are a little bit more fuzzy on the concept behind equity. So can you give us like the one-sentence summary of what equity means?
Well, great question, because it really isn't clear oftentimes. With a privately held company, they are shares of stock, and they can be preferred shares or common shares. All of those that I've issued for my company are common shares, and so when somebody invests in my company, Couragent, they get a stock certificate, a physical stock certificate, which is issued from the company and then can be sold by that individual to other individual investors. It's not shares of stock like you would trade on a public stock exchange like Dow Jones or any of those companies that are publicly traded. Rather, our equity, our shares of stock, are privately traded then. And initially, you know, as a company salesperson, as the CEO, I sell the shares of stock to those people as an equity investment. Now they become a part owner, if you will, in the company as holders of shares. Okay,
so that's pretty straightforward. The only difference is that you're talking about not going to the step of making it a public company where you're offering it on an open stock exchange, but the stock still has value that you can sell to somebody or sell back to the company or whatever, right?
Right, yes,
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Well, then let's move forward, and I'll talk about our founding members. And when you first launch your Colorado corporation or your corporation, it's really important to allocate your pool when you incorporate and you write your articles of incorporation. Now, you want to be sure that you're aware of what the dilution factor might be later on. If you issue, say, 1 million shares of founder shares at a nickel a share, Well, if you're going to go out and do a next round of $1 a share, those people who are now investing in the company are going to look at that and see that the cash value of their shares is fairly small. So you want to be careful about issuing too many low-priced shares to the founders, because that'll affect your ability later on to overcome the concern by investors about the dilution factor. It's also important to allocate a pool of options for incentives for employees and consultants later on. Make sure you don't leave out a portion, maybe 20 or 25% of your allocated shares should be set aside into a pool for incentive options. And then it's really critical to set your initial valuation of your company, because you're going to need that answer when you pitch and raise equity from angel investors later on. Well, what I did is I started in the mid-range. I found that in northern Colorado, typical first rounds, people tended to be around 3 million. And if you kind of stay in the center point of that, you don't raise any red flags with angel investors. If you start to get too high, there's been a lot of pushback in the industry lately about overvaluation of companies doing their offerings. And so I would err on the side of being fairly conservative there. And what we then did is moved in increments between each round as milestones were reached. And this is sort of jumping to the end point, but it gives you an idea of how this company, Couragent, is currently funded. We're doing a round right now, which is about $350,000, 175,000 shares, and our pre-money valuation is $4.89 million, and post-money it'll be that additional money that's raised through this round, which would put it at $5.2 million. Well, you see that the founding share members have about roughly 30% ownership in the company. A combination of private placements and employees converting their pay represents almost another third. I have a convertible note with our supplier, which represents another third. And this round is a relatively small round. It's just 7%. Now, if any of you have been on Shark Tank or watched that show, lots of times they negotiate these amounts, right? They say, well, I'll give you $20,000 for 30% of your company. And that pie for our company is, that's what that pie looks like right now for my company. Well, how did I get to this current valuation of about $5.2 million? Well, I did it in steps, starting with, of course, the bootstrapping funds from the founding members, but then extending that to friends and family, our first private placement. After that, we were valued at about $1 million. We did have a supplier convertible note. I'll talk about that in a minute, which then incremented our valuation by the amount of shares that were sold to the supplier. We did a private placement number 2, which again is the friends and family sorts of people who are investing at that point. Then we waited another 6 months and did a third private placement, and that takes the aspect of more friends. At that point, most of your family has probably already been tapped into. And I'm currently doing what's called a SCORE offering, a small company offering registration in 5 different states, which is a direct public offering. And I'll talk about those in a minute. But you see that over time, I've steadily incremented the valuation of the company by achieving certain milestones, such as building the first prototype and releasing the product to introduction and selling and reaching net cash positive flow and introducing new products. Each of those steps in my company's valuation has been directly attributed to certain milestones that have been met.
Thanks for sharing that, Gordon, because one of the things that's not apparent when you see something like Shark Tank is that the value changes over time. And it makes sense because, of course, your company, you're continuing to invest in, you're delivering things, you're getting customer money at some point. All of those things increase the value of the company, and yet they talk about valuation more in the concept of how much are you worth today, and so therefore how much money will I give you today? And they're typically pretty weak on talking about the value changing over time. So I appreciate this.
Very good. And also that shows the risk to the investors decreasing with time, right? I mean, when all you've got is an idea, there's a fairly high risk but a potential for high return. And each step you will find that your investor pool that you can pitch to increases because they have maybe a better matched tolerance to your risk level.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let me first talk about private placements. This is the place that most people start with offering equity, and it's often given to friends and family. These would be unaccredited investors. Typically, they don't have to pass the minimum income requirements that it would take to be an accredited investor. And it's also a good instrument to have, though, for those individual angel investors who are accredited. It's a document that helps them with their initial due diligence process to get you the cash quicker. It is a Reg D exclusion with the SEC, either 504 or 505. Those are legal terms. I don't have time to really talk too much about that. But private placements do take an awful lot of your time because you are pitching to individual people one-on-one, oftentimes in a coffee shop environment or maybe in a small group of people that you invited to listen about your presentation. With the private placement, you have to know the potential investor personally, either by meeting them in handshake mode, or you do a lot of networking events and things like that. But over time, with private placements, you're just going to run out of leads. At least, no matter how much networking you do, which is an essential part to being successful with the private placement, over time, it's just going to run out. I will mention that the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies, they're very friendly with startups. They'll give you fast response. The registration fees in the state of Colorado are pretty low, so I would call this Colorado to be a business-friendly and startup-friendly state in the area of the regulations. And they won't give you too much hassle with your private placement memorandum. The first PPM that I did, I raised $65,000 in 45 days, and it really only had to take upfront money from me of about $5,000. So that's a pretty effective round. Over 3 rounds, I raised $385,000. So this really was the mechanism that was the most, that gave me the most traction, that resulted in the most results for my company. And I recommend private placements for most people. I think that they're very effective. Here's some tips that I've learned about private placements. It is required that you have a 6-month continuation period between each of those private placements. So what you need to do is make sure you raise enough money in a private placement to get you to the next one. Nice thing about private placements is you can use the money immediately upon the investor writing you the check. But that also means that because you have to have the 6-month period in between, you better have enough runway to get to the next one before you exit that private placement. So be careful about how much you raise for each round. Now my private placements started again at $65,000. Then I went to a round that was $125,000. Then I did another round that was $250,000. So each of those incremented based on the success of the prior one. I did find that people that have self-directed IRAs were oftentimes the best investors, in that rather than take that money and maybe flip a house or invest it in coins or something like that, these people were very receptive to an equity investment in my company. And so therefore I provided them a little white paper and a contact with a firm down in Longmont that would help them get their IRAs converted into a self-directed IRA, where they can then invest in a company like ours without having to withdraw their funds with what's called a custodian. And they actually purchase shares in the company as if there was an administrator, but they never actually touch the cash, and so therefore they don't have any withdrawal penalties or tax implications with that. So be well versed about self-directed IRAs if you're doing a private placement. That'll open up a whole new pool of potential investors beyond that friends and family group. But for me and our company and the kind of product that we had, the sweet spot was what I'll call affinity investors, or people that just believe in the cause and that they like something about us, either that we're a Colorado company and we're creating Colorado jobs, or that we've got this really cool product, the flip-out mobile scanner, and they could see how that was going to be a very successful kind of a product, But again, you're not really doing a lot of group pitching with those types of investors. Instead, you're meeting with them one-on-one and just spending time with them and telling them about the people as much as you're telling them about the product. I think it's a great idea to have a PPM that's available off the shelf when you do have pitches to angel investor groups, and also a template of a convertible note that we talked about last session, which is a equity investment after the note has been converted. And I found that it was very important to have an accountant who is very good not only with running the numbers but also familiar with startups, because we operate in a different world than an established company. Typically we have a fair amount of debt. We're running on a lot of sweat equity kinds of roles, and that's important to have a good accountant at the very beginning that understands that and will keep your books so that later on you don't have to backtrack and try to fix up some mistakes there. But as with all sales kinds of activities, now you're selling your company instead of the product. It's really important to know who your customer is. And I'd like to share with you some of the people or the profiles of the investors that invested in my company through those 3 prior rounds of private placements. Well, it starts fairly small. 26 of those people invested $5,000. 12 people invested around $10,000. 4 invested $20,000, and only 2 invested $30,000. So that was sort of interesting. These are fairly small investments, but the sweet spot seemed to be I wanted to have a minimum amount of $5,000, and that's where most people entered in those private placement rounds. Other aspects about those kinds of investors that will invest in your private placements, relatively unsophisticated financially, but very sophisticated relationship-wise. They want to know the people. They want to get involved with the product and be interested in something that's just kind of getting off the ground. 4 of those people use their self-directed IRAs that I mentioned before. Now, talk about what you might say being technology averse. 2 of these investors didn't even have their own email. And so we converse mostly on the phone or meeting one-on-one.
Which is interesting for a technology product.
Isn't that something? Yes. And again, it's private placements are people that you know, friends and family, and oftentimes friends of the friends who invested the first time. They'll tell you their friends about your company, and then those people can contact you, and now they're eligible for you to contact them in terms of, asking them if they'd like to participate in the shareholders of the company. And, they don't use social media an awful lot. It's mostly the older folks that are using it to keep in touch with their children and grandchildren. So I don't think a private placement is a good mechanism to use like Facebook to reach out to people. And it's also, these people really like to keep in touch with me as the CEO and the other people. So I oftentimes, I make it a regular habit that I do a personalized newsletter for each of those people, at least quarterly, and just give them short emails. Sometimes they'll send me an email that says, how's it going? I can respond with a somewhat ready-to-go email for those people that are inquiring about what's going on.
So Gordon, with this level of investor, I've heard that one of the fears is people saying, well, they're going to get in there and think they have a right to tell me what to do with the company and waste my time and be a general pain in the butt. Has that been your experience, or have these people continued to be helpful and supportive and useful even a couple of years after you've got the investment?
Well, these people are friends and family, so they're already starting out to be on your side. They want you to succeed. And I have not found that concern to be true with these private placement kinds of offerings. However, as I get to a little bit later, I am doing crowdfunding. And now you're expanding your scope to people that you don't know because you're doing a direct offering, publicly solicited. And that is a concern, I think, that as people move towards a crowdfunding equity model, that is something that you do want to do, to be fairly, to vet, if you will, or screen those investors who are interested in investing in your company, so that you don't have, the sour grapes kind of a thing going on later on. But
Okay.
I think that still is an issue that will be worked out with time, and I've taken a certain approach with that, and time will tell. Again,
Okay.
the crowdfunding of equity is a leading edge initiative right now. So there are concerns, valid ones, and I think we're going to figure it out as we go.
Okay.
I have not found, to answer your question though, that the investors from my 3 prior private placements, even though there are now 44 of those people, they're very supportive. And I think it's important as the CEO and the people that they're investing in the company to give them information regularly. When anything good happens, for sure, send out an email that says, you know, we negotiated the price down on our new vendor relationship, or, you know, we had wonderful holiday sales. If I think you take the proactive approach and keep those people informed, I think they're going to be very supportive.
Excellent. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, the other mechanism that many people may not be aware of is the ability to do what I call sweat equity. And that's where consultants and your employees will take a portion of their pay as shares of stock rather than the cash, and they may actually defer some of their pay in debt to be paid later on. And that's been very effective for us. And in fact, what you've got now is a very empowered and incentivized group of employees and consultants who will do work for you based on the promise that later on the shares of stock that they get as a result are going to be worth a whole lot more than just taking the cash at the time. We did allow our employees and consultants to accrue their back pay and then convert it later to shares at a discount, 20%. Now the disadvantage of that is that becomes a taxable event when they do the conversion, so they need to make sure that they've got the income tax withheld or be ready to pay that the next year that they file their income taxes. But most of our people who have been as consultants or employees, well, 85% actually, have done that, taken their back pay and actually purchased shares of stock with it at a 20% discount. Well, that really helps your cash flow. At the beginning, when you don't have income coming in, you're having high expenses to get your product launched into the marketplace. This is a great mechanism to make progress towards those goals without having the cash. But you have to remember that's going to hit the balance sheet. It's going to show up as a debt. So you've got to be very careful about managing the number of hours that you burn at the initial startup phase of your company, so that you've got a balance between your cash flow and accrued debt. But now that we are positive cash flow, we pay back a portion each month in cash to those people that accrued their back pay, and we just set aside a certain point so that we are gradually working down the debt that we owe our consultants, who then can take that and convert it to equity because they have a little bit of cash to pay the taxes later on. So don't overlook that. We have multiple people who have done consultant work for us, and very valuable work that I couldn't have afforded to have done because of the cash that was available to the company at that point in time. But make sure you get this in writing, because later on, you know, if it gets audited by the IRS or somebody like that, you want to make sure you have really good records of both the consultant contract and any agreement that you've made with their ability to convert that to shares. All right. Well, let me talk about crowdfunding, because that is such an exciting new area of raising funds. And the concept here, at least with equity crowdfunding, is that, you know, many people with smaller amounts of money can pool it together and make a fairly decent pile of money that then we as entrepreneurs can turn our idea into a reality and issue shares of stock back to those people, who then, you know, will end up in a couple of years with more money than if all they ended up with in a perks crowdfunding mode of a first article or a coupon to redeem later on. This is a different model. What I'm talking about here is equity crowdfunding rather than perks or rewards crowdfunding, which many people have heard about from Kickstarter and Indiegogo and many other sites like that. What I'm doing is actual crowdfunding of equity. And I'm using a mechanism which is called a direct public offering, or a DPO for short. And that allows me to solicit openly to unaccredited investors across the country. I can raise up to $1 million this way in 12 months. And now I've taken a concept of private placements, which is many small investors rather than a few large investors such as angels. And now, well, now it's many, 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 many small investors, because each of them are contributing a small amount, using the web as a mechanism to do that. Well, the mechanism in the states that is used for that is called the Small Company Offering Registration. The registration document is called the Form U7. Now this is, again, a statewide registration, so you have to register in each state, whereas the Jobs Bill, Article 2, is going to be a federal or a nationwide registration. So that is still a work in progress, and who knows how long that's going to take. But the SCORE offering is available today. And when you go to other states, they will coordinate their review regionally, like the Northwest. Pacific regions, well, 7 or 8 states will get together. They'll only have one of the Department of Regulatory agencies review the document, and then they combine their feedback and give it back to me so that I can modify the Form U7, and then they will register the document in all of those states at one time.
So what matters is what state you're in, right? You can still have investors that are scattered across the country and maybe across the world?
Yes, well, 44 states in the United States will honor or are part of this group of states that will use the SCORE offering document, the Form U7.
Okay.
And so, but you do have to pay a registration fee for each of those states. So you want to kind of cherry pick those states that you think you will do well in, and those states that I call business friendly or startup friendly, because their registration fees are fairly small. So that's a fairly time-consuming process to figure out which states you want to register in. For my registration, I'm in Colorado and Wyoming, Nebraska, Illinois, and New York. So, you know, you want to just pick those states reasonably to get a high bang for your buck for the registration.
Which means you can't accept investors from any other state then.
That's right. Unless I were to register then in those other states.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Okay, now the Form RL is a little bit less expensive and a less time-intensive document to create, but that's only for Colorado. So if you want to do a direct public offering in the state of Colorado and you may not have audited financials, there's another mechanism called the Form RL, which is very cost-effective to raise funds. Typically, these are min-max raises, and I don't have time to talk about those, but a minimum is where you have to clear an escrow amount before you can use the funds, up to a maximum amount. It may require audited financials, and that is a big issue also with the jobs article, is what levels of raises will require audited financials, and the same thing is true. Certain states will require audited financials and others not. So again, it's an iterative process. You pick a state, and then you decide whether you want to pay the registration fees and or do the audited financials. But really, this is a form of crowdfunding. We are using a website. It is curinvestor.com. It's been live for about 6 months. People can go to this site, read about the company, shows the states that it's registered in, what our current raise amount is. You can do all of the social media kinds of things. They can post a question to me and I can answer it. I do periodic updates when we reach certain milestones, and I like that big green button in the top right-hand corner which says, I want to invest. All they need to do there is click that button, and then they can register, get a subscription document, and we can complete the transaction all using the web. So it's a pretty exciting way of raising funds, but it's still leading edge. There's still a lot of issues and talk about how this is going to work out over the years. But I'm one of the first in the country that have actually done that. And I've also found a success factor for crowdfunding on the web is going to be ability to do videos. Instead of doing pitches in person, now because you're using the internet as your delivery mechanism, you'll want to be learning about and becoming proficient at generating videos and doing things like webinars, because you're reaching out to these unaccredited investors using their web browser when they're sitting maybe in their living room on a Saturday night instead of coming to a pitch event that there's maybe hundreds or thousands of other people at. So that's pretty interesting new ways of doing that. Now what works in perks crowdfunding and is also probably elements of success when doing equity crowdfunding, look at the data. 30% of those perks-based crowdfunding like Kickstarter have an 80% success rate at the end of their campaign if they've raised 30% of their money within the first 7 days. Okay, that's pretty important data. The second part is that those people that raised 80% of their funds in 21 days had a 90% success rate. Okay, what that means is the best practice is to make sure that before you launch your crowdfunding initiative or campaign, make sure you have about 30% of your people already lined up as people that you know or maybe have invested before and they want to invest again from your private placements. And you've got a direct connection with, so that when you go live, you can show, hey, this is a hot thing. And that is what attracts people to crowdfunding is they want to invest in something that's successful. And if out of the gate, you know, within the first week you're hitting already your 20 or 25% milestones in terms of your raise, that will attract people to invest in your company. And the group that I know of in Colorado that are the best at providing information about crowdfunding is this group called the Colorado Crowdfunding Meetup, and they have some very well done seminars on crowdfunding that I would recommend if you're interested in going that direction. They cover also the other types of crowdfunding like Kickstarter and Indiegogo and even some of the other types of donation-based sites if you're interested in that as a nonprofit.
Very cool, Gordon.
Well, this is
now,
my map.
when you use the word success on that slide, the way you define success is that they achieved their funding goal.
Well, it's really clear on Kickstarter, right? I mean, you say ahead of time, I'm going to raise $150,000, and when you reach the $150,000, they give you the money, and so definitely that's a success.
Okay.
Whereas others may be a little bit more nebulous. Maybe on Indiegogo you wanted to raise $500,000 and you reach $300,000. You know, that could be considered to be a goal, but I think that the campaign goal which you set at the initiation of the campaign is, if that was met, then that would be considered in these statistics to have been a success.
Excellent. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, well, I've got this map of the world. I like these two-axis kinds of views of things, and you see that I've chosen the vertical axis to be how close of a relationship you have as the company to your potential investor. And the top is having a very close relationship, like in friends and family, and the bottom being a distant relationship, as you might have when you're doing a crowdfunding and you are registered in the state of New York. Those people are far, far away. And there's different ways for you to reach out to them, either with advertising or personal contact, depending on the relationship that you have. And on the horizontal axis, I talk about the characteristics of the potential investor, in particular what kind of money they have available. You know, some people raising, maybe wanting to invest as low as $100 in a Kickstarter campaign, all the way up to angel investors or even venture capital people that have some private wealth, willing to invest $200,000 or something like that. And then on that, also on that axis, I've shown what I consider to be rates of the raise, all the way from maybe $10,000 up to $5 million. And so this is where I place crowdfunding. Equity crowdfunding is in those areas where you want to raise between maybe $30,000 to $50,000 up to maybe $500,000. And the investor pool that you're looking at there maybe have somewhere between $1,000 up to $10,000 to invest in your company. But you're reaching out to them primarily with online media, social media, Facebook, Twitter, those kinds of things, and maybe doing some outbound marketing with business journals and these newsletters and press releases and things like that. That's how you take the advantage of the internet to do your marketing for your equity round of crowdfunding. Okay, now the next area that I see, Kickstarter and Indiegogo, is being the smaller raises, and you're primarily using social media to reach out to those people. and get them interested and knowledgeable about what you're raising money for. Now up in that top left-hand corner where you're doing a direct offering like I am currently, and you're reaching out to people who might have an affinity for your company, that's where I would put that group of people. If you're trying to do raising money between maybe $10,000 all the way up to $500,000, I think that fits very well with those groups of people that you know reasonably well also. Now, if you're interested in reaching out to accredited investors and you're going to pitch events like the Rockies Venture Club down in Denver, High Altitude Investors down in Colorado Springs, and the Colorado Angels here in Fort Collins, then you are inviting them to come to more of a personal invitation to a pitch event. And that fits into that category of people who are accredited. Probably they're doing a raise of $100,000 or more. And then if you were to go a bit above that, there are investor websites like Ghost and others where you put in a profile, your company valuation, the strategic direction of your company, and they try to match you up with other investors, typically accredited investors or other groups. And I haven't got a lot of traction out of those, even though they can be fairly time-consuming to do the profile online. And then if you do have direct contact with friends and family, accredited investors, and you're wanting to raise $1 million to $5 million, I think you can do that in that top right-hand corner with a term sheet. And then the direct contact, what I'll call the adventure investors, who, they just want to be part of something really cool and leading edge, and here you're doing an offering which matches their sense of adventure, to take a certain amount of the money that's available to them for investing not only in the stock exchange like Dow Jones, but also some people like us who are entrepreneurs who have this really novel, unique idea which potentially could turn into a game changer in the future. And people have set aside certain amounts of their money to do that. Well, the bottom line for me is there's so many different tools that you can use, not only equity but also debt. And fill your toolbox or your tool bench with all kinds of these different tools that I've outlined, and then pick the ones that are going to fit your goals for your company that you decided earlier, and time will tell. You never know when maybe an angel investor is going to contact you that you talked to 2 years ago, and now they're finally ready to invest in your company. So always be networking, always have a range of tools in your toolbox, because no one of these things that I talked about is going to be, the silver bullet. People talk about crowdfunding being exciting, and I agree, it is absolutely exciting, but it's not a replacement for or the catch-all for any types of investors that you're going to be running into in the future. And I hope that I've been able to give you a little bit of personal information about which of the tools that I've used might be very useful to you as you get your company off the ground.
This has really been useful, Gordon. I appreciate it. And one of the things that I've learned here, the reason why I would want to have different tools in my toolbox is because I see a lot of people that go out and use the wrong tool at the wrong time. They go out and ask for a $10 million investor when they don't really have something established that shows that they're ready to make use of that money and do it in a way that is relatively low risk, or they get eaten alive by teeny little investors and are never able to build up to something larger and more sustainable. So I really like the idea of having this portfolio of tools available to you, and use different tools at different stages of business.
Well, yes. In fact, I will relay a mistake that I made.
Okay.
Trying to go too fast, which is, how I identified that I took these private placements in different steps with about 6 months in between? Well, after a fairly successful second private placement, I raised $150,000. I said, oh, we've got so much momentum, I'm going to jump right away to a VC firm in Chicago, Illinois. And they have this great group of investors who would be a great match to my company. Well, I spent a fair amount of time creating all the legal documents, and we got no traction. And the feedback was we were a tweener. We weren't a startup, so it didn't really fit into their investors' model of a startup, right? because we were in revenue. We were making profit, and we had traction in the marketplace. We had a lot of things going for us, but we weren't also big enough for what they call their growth funds. We were in between these two phases in those groups of people who have private money to invest in a company. All right, so it's, I think, a lesson learned for me that I'd like others to know is take it in steps. Use the right tool, as Carl, you mentioned, for the time that you're at in the evolution of your company, and be very careful about skipping a step, because you can lose a lot of time doing something that you think is going to be a, you're going to shorten the time. But even with all of the traction that I had with our product and our people and the prior rounds, I tried to skip a step, and I paid the price.
Yeah, and the other thing that I've learned is that this is not a territory for extreme winging it. You want to have your accountant lined up. You want to have your lawyers lined up, because you're playing around with stuff that the government pays a lot of attention to, and you don't want to get on the bad side of that.
Very good point. Yeah, hire good consultants for your accountants when you get things started, and good legal documents to incorporate your company, because those are going to be very important as you increase your pool of investors who are now shareholders in your company. And if they ask you a question about whether you do the due diligence and you have audited financials, it's a lot more expensive later on to correct mistakes that you might have overlooked at the founding of your company than it is to just get it right the first time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Gordon. Everything you say is just so enlightening and informative, and I've learned so much. I do have a question. I know that your company in particular is a product-based business. You have your FlipPal mobile scanner. But as I'm listening, I'm thinking if anybody's on the call and they're thinking about growing more of a consulting or a service-based business where they're selling a service as opposed to a product, how successful do you believe these types of funding mechanisms would be for them? Is it slightly altered, or have you found that what you're talking about primarily is more successful in a product-based business?
Great question, because there's so many of those people that would love to get their business going, but they just can't because you don't have the cash, right? And I believe that those private placements are a great mechanism for getting even a service or consultant-based business off the ground, because they are people that you can contact with. There's not a lot of legal fees to get those going, and they can give you the money quickly. You know, as I mentioned, in 45 days I raised $65,000, and I've seen many case studies of other people raising that kind of money. The later rounds, as I mentioned, when I'm doing even the crowdfunding now on equity and any of those other convertible note kinds of things, those probably are better suited for a company like mine, where we have a physical product that we're selling worldwide, you know, and we have fairly high capitalization costs, whereas something that's a smaller, maybe a privately owned company or a small partnership, I think the private placements are a good fit for those kinds of places.
Thank you. I think that helps people who are thinking they might be lining themselves up away perhaps from a product-based business.
Yeah, well,
you know,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in northern Colorado, many of the opportunities really are smaller companies with not physical products, and that has got a lot of traction in this area, and in fact it attracts investors with those kinds of ideas in mind. Whereas, well, I guess you could say our Trojan and our FlipPal mobile scanner, it's fairly anomaly in startup business world these days. I only know of maybe 3 or 4 other entrepreneurs in this area, in the Fort Collins area, that are following a similar model. But yeah, again, I think that those private placements are a very well done tool, particularly because we have a state that is very business friendly in the area of helping startups get off the ground.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gordon. We do appreciate you coming and speaking with all of us today. This has been wonderful. Leslie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself again?
Okay. Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Gordon. As always, very enlightening. Again, my name is Leslie Lautzenhiser, and I'm with FranChoice. And I provide a free service for individuals who are exploring entrepreneurship as it relates mostly to an interest in a franchise. And I help explore whether or not a franchise is a good fit for them, and if so, what franchise makes the most sense to support their long-term, short-term goals and their lifestyle. So we'll be pleased to chat with anybody who's interested in a franchise. And thank you for joining us today. Carl.
Yeah, I'm Carl Dierschow with Small Fish Business Coaching, and I help entrepreneurs who are building great companies to put together their plans and actually achieve their objectives, get to that next stage of growth, and build the kind of company that they want to build. So thank you, everyone, today. Watch out for our next installment. That'll be coming soon. We'll let you know. We've got a dedicated web page now set up for this, and so hopefully all of you are hooked into that. Take care, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much.